A hushed silence filled the courtroom as the doors creaked open, and she stepped in. Her every move was deliberate, her posture regal, yet unassuming. Dressed in a simple yet elegant black dress, the black woman stood out, not just because of her presence, but because of the calm authority she exuded. Whispers rippled across the room, and eyes darted between her and the towering figure behind the bench. Judge Samuel Whitmore. Judge Whitmore, known for his unyielding demeanor and firm grasp of courtroom order, sat tall, his gavel resting in his hand. His reputation preceded him, a man of rules, discipline, and, as some critics whispered, outdated notions of justice. Today, however, was no ordinary hearing. This wasn't just about laws or legal procedures. It was about something deeper, more visceral: identity, power, and the silent undercurrents of societal prejudice. As the woman reached the defendant's table, she paused, making brief eye contact with the judge. There was a flicker of recognition, or was it defiance, in her eyes. Judge Whitmore's brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. He cleared his throat, masking whatever unease he might have felt. "State your name for the record," his voice echoed, steady yet cautious. She smiled faintly, leaning into the microphone. "Madam Justice," she replied, her voice firm and resonant. The room froze. "Madam Justice?" Judge Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Is that your legal name?" She straightened, meeting his gaze head-on. "It's the name I've earned." Her words were calm, but carried the weight of someone who had fought long and hard battles. This wasn't just any case. It was a battle of perceptions, deeply rooted in history, power structures, and societal norms. A black woman standing in defiance of a white judge wasn't something this courtroom, or society, was used to seeing. The stakes were higher than they appeared on the surface. This wasn't just about her identity or the judge's authority. It was about challenging the very fabric of a system built on centuries of imbalance. The air grew thick with anticipation as everyone present sensed that something monumental was about to unfold. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered with signs that read "Justice knows no color" and "Identity is power." Inside, the tension crackled like electricity, each person wondering how this encounter would end. Would the judge maintain his authority, or would the woman's revelation shift the paradigm entirely? But why did this encounter matter so much? Because, in a world where appearances often dictate assumptions, this was a direct challenge to the preconceived narratives that shape our lives. A revelation was coming, one that would shake not only the courtroom, but the community beyond its walls. Judge Whitmore's eyes remained locked on the woman standing before him. He shifted in his seat, his gavel tapping gently on the bench, a rhythm of control he used to ground himself. "Madam Justice," he repeated, his voice tight with disbelief, "the court doesn't operate on titles earned outside its walls. I need your legal name." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "My name is Imani Carter," she stated, her tone calm yet charged with underlying strength. "But Madam Justice is more than a title. It represents what I've dedicated my life to, seeking justice where it's been denied." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Imani Carter. The name sounded familiar to some, though they couldn't place it. To others it was just another name, but Judge Whitmore's reaction revealed that he knew exactly who she was. His fingers gripped the gavel tighter. "You're here as a defendant, Ms. Carter." "Not an advocate," Whitmore replied, his voice sharp, as if to reassert his authority. Imani's lips curled into a faint smile. "I'm here because this system, your system, mistook me for someone who couldn't fight back." The tension was palpable now. The judge's skepticism was no longer hidden, yet Imani's confidence remained unshaken. She had been in this position before, not in this specific courtroom, but in countless others, where her race, her gender, and her identity were questioned more than her actions. Imani's presence alone was a challenge to the courtroom's unspoken rules. To many, she was a defendant. To those who truly knew her, she was a trailblazer, a civil rights attorney who had spent years defending marginalized communities. Her arrests during protests, her fierce speeches in courtrooms, and her tireless work had earned her the nickname Madam Justice. But this wasn't just another day in court. This was personal. Years ago, Imani had walked into her first courtroom as a defense attorney, fresh out of law school. She was nervous but determined, aware that her presence as a young black woman was already being scrutinized. She'd watched older, white attorneys dismiss her, and judges question her credibility. But she hadn't backed down. She fought for every client, every case, and every inch of respect she earned. One case stood out: the wrongful eviction of an elderly black couple from their home of 40 years. The opposing counsel belittled her, reducing her arguments to emotional pleas rather than legal fact. But Imani dismantled their arguments piece by piece, using precedent, law, and a sharp intellect that left the courtroom stunned. It wasn't just about winning, it was about proving she belonged. Each case became a battle against systemic prejudice, each victory a step toward dismantling it. Judge Whitmore's voice broke through the courtroom's heavy silence. Ms. Carter, regardless of your personal beliefs, you are subject to the same laws as anyone else. This court will not tolerate grandstanding. Imani raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor unwavering. Grandstanding? Is that what you call standing up for one's rights? Because if I'm guilty of anything, it's refusing to be silent when injustice prevails. Her words hung in the air, sharp and precise. For a moment, the courtroom held its breath, caught between the authority of the judge and the moral weight of Imani's defiance. The hidden conflict was clear now. This wasn't just a legal confrontation. It was a collision of identities, of a system that often saw blackness as a threat, and of a woman who had spent her life challenging that narrative. From the bench, Judge Whitmore felt an unsettling tension within himself. He had presided over countless cases, many involving people of color. He'd convinced himself that he was fair, unbiased. But now, facing Imani Carter, something gnawed at him. He could feel the weight of his own prejudices, the subtle assumptions he had carried for years, the moments when he'd dismissed the voices of people like her. He was suddenly aware of how deeply ingrained these biases were, and it unsettled him. Whitmore's thoughts drifted to an earlier memory, his father, a judge in the 1960s, who once told him, "Justice is about order. Don't let emotion cloud your judgment." He had clung to that belief his entire career, but now, he wondered if maintaining order had come at the cost of justice itself. The courtroom, too, was shifting. Spectators leaned forward, their eyes flicking between Imani and the judge. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone sensed they were witnessing something greater than just a legal proceeding. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that the case had spiraled into territory far beyond his control. This was no longer just about Imani's alleged infraction. It was about the very fabric of justice. Whitmore inhaled deeply. "Ms. Carter, this court is not a platform for social commentary. It is a place for law and order." Imani nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "And yet, Judge Whitmore, law and order mean nothing if justice is absent." Her words echoed throughout the room, leaving a resounding silence. The conflict was no longer hidden. It was right there, laid bare for all to see. This was a moment of reckoning, not just for Imani, but for the judge, the courtroom, and the very system they represented. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier with each passing moment. Whispers of curiosity fluttered through the crowd like a rising windstorm, fueled by Imani Carter's composed defiance and the judge's mounting agitation. Something about her felt familiar now, not just to the judge but to others in the room, though they couldn't quite place it. Judge Whitmore furrowed his brow, his mind racing as he rifled through memories. Where had he heard her name before? Why did her presence unsettle him so deeply? He wasn't just grappling with her arguments. He was confronting something far more personal. As the courtroom clerk handed over Imani's file, the judge hesitated. There, in black and white, lay her background, a graduate of a top-tier law school, a renowned civil rights attorney, and a woman who had been making waves for years in the fight against systemic oppression. But something else caught his eye, a familiar name buried within her family history. His throat tightened. He skimmed through her lineage, eyes scanning frantically, until he froze on a single entry: Eleanor Whitmore Carter. His mother's maiden name. Whitmore's heart pounded in his chest. His grip on the gavel tightened instinctively, but his authority felt as though it were slipping through his fingers. Could it be true? He dared a glance at Imani, her calm gaze meeting his. She knew. The prosecutor, sensing the judge's unease, stood and cleared his throat. Your Honor, before proceeding further, the prosecution requests a recess. But Whitmore shook his head. Denied. His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. Ms. Carter, please explain to this court why you believe you are above the law. Imani stepped forward, her voice measured but firm. I don't believe I'm above the law, Your Honor. I believe the law is supposed to serve justice, and when it doesn't, it must be challenged. She paused, then added, and perhaps the law is something I understand better than most. After all, I was raised around it. My great-grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, was a lawyer who fought for civil rights in the 1950s. Maybe you've heard of her. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Judge Whitmore sat back in his chair, visibly shaken. Whitmore's mind reeled back to his childhood. His grandmother, Eleanor, had been a quiet yet formidable presence in their family. A woman of grace and intellect who never spoke much about her career, only hinting at battles fought and lost in a world that wasn't ready for a black female lawyer. She had passed away before Whitmore was old enough to truly understand her significance, but he remembered the stories his father used to tell, how Eleanor fought relentlessly for justice, even when it meant standing against the very system she was supposed to trust. His family had distanced themselves from her activism, fearing the repercussions of being associated with a cause deemed radical at the time. It was something Whitmore had buried deep, never once questioning his complicity in that erasure. Until now. Imani continued, her voice unwavering as she narrated her family's history. Eleanor Whitmore didn't just practice law, she lived it. She fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves, and she taught her children and their children to do the same. She believed in justice, even when the system didn't believe in her. Her eyes scanned the room. I grew up hearing those stories, but I didn't just inherit her courage. I inherited her battles. I've been denied jobs, targeted by law enforcement, and dismissed by people who didn't think someone like me belonged in this profession. Yet, I'm still here standing before you, not just for myself, but for every person this system has failed. The courtroom was spellbound. Imani's words cut through the air like a blade, leaving no room for indifference. Spectators sat in rapt silence, and even the prosecutor had lowered his head, avoiding her gaze. Judge Whitmore's composure was unraveling. His mind raced between the woman standing before him and the echoes of his grandmother's voice in his memory. He could no longer separate his personal history from the case at hand. The gavel in his hand felt like a weight tethering him to reality, yet he couldn't bring himself to strike it. His biases, once hidden behind the veneer of law and order, were now laid bare. He realized that his authority was not just about legal precedent. It was about the moral choices he made in moments like these. Whitmore exhaled shakily, meeting Imani's gaze once more. Ms. Carter, he began, his voice softer, this court is meant to uphold the law. But today, you've reminded us all that the law must also serve justice. Please, continue. Imani nodded, sensing the shift in the room. She recounted personal instances of systemic injustice, being stopped by police without cause, her law firm refusing her a partnership despite her track record, and the countless courtrooms where she had to prove her competence twice over simply because of her skin color. Each revelation deepened the emotional tension, forcing everyone present to confront their complicity in a flawed system. Whitmore's struggle was evident, The courtroom watched as he wrestled with his conscience, realizing that this case was no longer just about legalities, but about his family's legacy and his role in either perpetuating or dismantling systemic injustice. As Imani's story reached its crescendo, her voice steady but impassioned, Whitmore knew there was no turning back. The courtroom had become a crucible of truth, and he, like everyone else, was being reshaped by it. The heavy silence in the courtroom hung like a tangible force, pressing down on everyone in the room. The air seemed to crackle with the tension of unspoken realizations. It was as if the courtroom itself had shifted, transformed into a battleground not just for legal arguments, but for deeply entrenched beliefs and ideologies. The power dynamics had subtly but undeniably shifted. Judge Whitmore, who had once held his position as an immovable authority, now seemed less certain of his own place in the hierarchy of justice. Imani Carter stood at the center of this whirlwind, her posture calm yet charged with an energy that was both defiant and magnetic. She had already proven her strength, her resilience, and her dedication to a cause that was much larger than any individual or case. Her words had pierced through the layers of bias, and now, the entire courtroom watched as the judge grappled with the implications of his own actions and inactions. Judge Whitmore sat motionless, his hands folded on the desk before him, his gavel resting untouched. His eyes, once so certain and commanding, now darted nervously between the various pieces of evidence laid out before him and Imani's unwavering gaze. He had been forced to confront a harsh truth. The very biases he had worked to bury had surfaced, unbidden, in this courtroom. And worse yet, they had been exposed not by an outsider or adversary, but by someone who shared a painful connection to his own past. Ms. Carter, Whitmore's voice wavered, betraying the vulnerability he had spent his entire career concealing. Your words have shaken me to my core. I had no idea. He paused, searching for the right words, feeling the weight of his position as he addressed the woman who had so expertly dismantled the illusion of neutrality he had once held so dear. Imani didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She had already won the battle. Her silence in response to his apology was not one of rejection, but of understanding. She knew that this moment wasn't about seeking vindication or forgiveness. It was about change, real change that reached beyond this courtroom and touched the hearts and minds of all who had borne witness. The judge continued, his voice now tinged with a deep sense of remorse. I've spent my life assuming that I was above the biases that have infected this system. But now, I see that I've been part of it all along, and I can no longer pretend that my role as a judge has been as neutral as I believed. His voice faltered, but the truth was undeniable. I'm sorry. The apology hung in the air, not just directed at Imani, but at everyone in the room who had ever been subjected to the biases he had allowed to persist. It wasn't enough to simply apologize. His actions moving forward would have to be the true measure of his transformation. As Whitmore's words reverberated throughout the room, a subtle shift began to take place. The tension that had once defined the space began to dissipate, replaced by a collective sense of introspection. Even the prosecutor, who had been visibly skeptical of Imani's arguments, nodded in silent agreement. It was as though the entire courtroom had collectively recognized the power of truth when it was laid bare. Imani's courage had done more than just expose Whitmore's biases. It had shaken the very foundations of the system he represented. For the first time, the people in that room saw their roles not just as passive observers of justice, but as active participants in the perpetuation of prejudice. Imani's eyes, though full of quiet strength, softened as she addressed the room. This isn't just about me, or the judge, or even this case. This is about every person who has been judged before their time. It's about the system that has failed to see beyond the color of someone's skin, the weight of their name, or the assumptions we make based on where they come from. She paused, letting her words sink in. We must all hold ourselves accountable, she continued, her voice steady yet filled with a powerful conviction. accountable for the biases we carry, for the judgments we pass, and for the systems we've allowed to thrive unchecked. The spectators, now fully engaged, found themselves questioning their own beliefs, their own biases. It was as if the walls that had once separated them from the harsh realities of systemic injustice had come crashing down. The truth, unvarnished and raw, had been laid out before them, and they had no choice but to confront it. As the hearing continued, Whitmore's demeanor had completely transformed. No longer the cold, authoritative figure who had once been the embodiment of the law, he now seemed to carry the weight of the very system he had served. But his transformation wasn't one of guilt. It was one of understanding. He had come to realize that his authority as a judge was not a shield from accountability, but a responsibility to ensure fairness and justice for all people, regardless of race or background. Imani had not only changed the course of this trial, but she had ignited something deeper within him, a desire to do better, to truly serve justice, not just uphold the law. Whitmore's voice, though still cautious, was now infused with newfound purpose. I am deeply sorry for the harm my biases have caused, both in this courtroom and in the broader system. From this moment forward, I will do everything in my power to ensure that justice is not just administered, but truly served to all people without exception. The statement was powerful, and though it was just words, the sincerity with which Whitmore spoke them made them feel like a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire courtroom. Outside the courtroom, the ripple effect of what had transpired was already beginning to take shape. News outlets began to cover the unprecedented moment of transformation that had taken place, and social media exploded with conversations about the systemic issues that had been exposed during the trial. Hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #EndSystemicBias trended, and people across the country began to reflect on their own roles in perpetuating injustice. But more than just the public reaction, the true impact lay in the way the trial had shifted societal views on justice, race, and identity. It was no longer just a case about a woman fighting for her rights. It was a microcosm of the larger fight for racial equality and the dismantling of a system that had too long ignored the voices of marginalized communities. Imani Carter had become more than just a symbol of resilience. She had become a catalyst for change. And in her courage, she had shown that the most powerful weapon against injustice is not just defiance, but truth. The courtroom had emptied, but the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air, a presence that refused to dissipate. The gavel had fallen, signaling the end of the trial, but it was only the beginning of something much more significant, a shift in the hearts and minds of all who had borne witness. Outside, the city continued its pulse of daily life, unaware of the seismic changes that had just reverberated through the justice system. Yet for those present in that courtroom, life had irrevocably changed. They had seen truth laid bare, and they would never be the same again. In the days that followed, Judge Whitmore's life seemed to be in turmoil. His public apology, though sincere, was not enough to erase the guilt that gnawed at him. The faces of the jurors, the witnesses, and especially Imani Carter, haunted him. He could no longer look at his bench the same way, nor could he wear his robe with the same sense of detached authority. His role had been reduced from that of a symbol of justice to one of reflection, a man standing at the crossroads of his own beliefs. He had changed, but not in the way he had hoped. It wasn't the smooth, unchallenged transformation he had imagined, where he would simply accept his flaws, apologize, and move forward as a more enlightened man. Instead, it was a slow, grueling process, one that forced him to confront the depths of his ingrained biases. Whitmore had always considered himself above the prejudices that stained the system. He had believed that simply being a judge meant he was impartial above reproach. But he now saw the cracks in that belief, how despite his best efforts, his decisions, his behavior, his words had been shaped by the very biases he had claimed to reject. Every ruling, every dismissal of a case, every decision made had been affected by the biases he had once believed to be invisible. Now, in the quiet of his office, he couldn't escape the weight of that reality. The internal struggle was real. Was he truly capable of changing, or was he bound to repeat the same patterns that had led him to this moment of reckoning? He had taken the first step, admitting his faults publicly, but could he make real change in his practice, in the cases he would decide from now on? Or would he always be haunted by the woman who had shown him the mirror of his own bias? For Imani Carter, the victory was not one of celebration, but of quiet resolve. She had known from the moment she stepped into the courtroom that this trial was about more than just a case. It was about dismantling systems of injustice that had long been in place. As she walked away from the courthouse that day, the weight of her own journey seemed to lighten. She had done what she came to do, not just for herself, but for countless others who would come after her, still fighting against the same forces she had faced. Imani wasn't interested in the accolades or the recognition. She had already been fighting a war much larger than this moment. Her true victory lay in the seeds she had planted. She had made the world see, if only for a moment, how much power one individual could have in challenging centuries-old systems. Her victory was not just a personal one. It was the victory of every person who had been told they were less than, who had been denied justice, or whose humanity had been reduced to the stereotypes of others. As she walked away, Imani's thoughts weren't consumed by the trial she had just won, but by the work that still lay ahead. She knew the road wasn't over, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was a little shorter now. Her story, her bravery, would be the catalyst for many others to find their own courage and voice. In her silence, she spoke volumes. She had shown the world that the true measure of power was not in who you were on paper, but in the unshakable conviction of who you were as a person. The courtroom event had ignited something far greater than Imani had anticipated. The ripple effect of her challenge reverberated far beyond the walls of the courthouse. In the weeks that followed, news outlets were inundated with stories about the trial. Think pieces, op-eds, and public forums were filled with discussions about race, bias, and systemic injustice in the legal system. Professors, activists, and ordinary citizens debated the implications of what had unfolded and how to ensure that such a moment of reckoning wasn't just a fleeting one. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForAll, #ChangeTheSystem, and #EndBias, as millions shared their own stories and reflections. The conversation shifted, and for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of urgency around addressing the realities of racial inequality. More than that, it was a call to action. People began to recognize that change was not something to be passively awaited. It was something to be actively pursued. Within the legal system, there were calls for more comprehensive training on unconscious bias, not just for judges, but for law enforcement officers, attorneys, and court staff. Imani's victory had shaken the foundations of a system that had long remained resistant to change. And while one courtroom moment could not undo centuries of injustice, it was undeniable that a crack had appeared in the edifice of entrenched systems. As the world moved on, the story of Imani Carter's courtroom challenge continued to resonate. But her legacy was not just in the immediate changes it sparked. It was in the transformation of perspective it fostered. In one moment, one courtroom trial, a black woman had not just confronted a judge, she had confronted a system, and in doing so, had made it question its very foundations. On the eve of the anniversary of the trial, Imani sat in her apartment, reflecting on how far she had come and how far the world still had to go. It had been a year of change, both personal and societal. But as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she knew this was just the beginning. There were still so many more battles to fight, and still so many hearts and minds to reach. She remembered a quote from her grandmother, a woman who had also fought for justice in a time when such battles seemed insurmountable. It had always stuck with her, and now it felt even more relevant. Justice isn't something you wait for. It's something you create. Those words would echo in Imani's heart for years to come, driving her toward new battles, new opportunities for change. And though the courtroom battle had been won, Imani knew that true victory came in the work that followed, laying the groundwork for a world where justice, true justice, would not be something you had to fight for, but something that simply existed for everyone. As Imani Carter faded into the horizon, walking away from a courthouse that had once been her battleground, the world paused. The energy she had created was palpable, and it lingered like a quiet whisper in the hearts of those who had witnessed her challenge. It was a moment that would never be forgotten, and it was a reminder that change, no matter how daunting, is possible if one person dares to stand up against the forces that seek to silence them. In the end, the true lesson wasn't just about winning in court. It was about winning hearts and minds, about dismantling the biases that had long shaped society, and about forging a future where true justice could be realized, not just for a few, but for all.